Russia breaking news. It was I who advised Putin. I publicly accused him of wrongdoing. I was in the anteroom of Alexei Kudrin's office on July 25, 1998. I was in the middle of a conversation on Russia's impending financial catastrophe with him, his aides, and a couple of visitors when someone slipped in behind me. He was the country's first deputy finance minister. Although I failed to spot anyone, it seemed like everyone was staring at the stranger. It was obvious that this was no ordinary guest. Upon his approach, I noticed that he was a shorter man dressed in an exceptionally peculiar pale green suit, quite out of character for an official in Moscow's power circles. The individual was identified as Vladimir Putin, who had been appointed director of Russia's domestic intelligence arm, the FSB, by Russian President Boris Yeltsin earlier that morning. Just by happenstance, I happened to be here. Apparently, Putin's closest friend in Moscow at the time, Kudrin, was Putin's first stop upon arriving. Kudrin wanted me to tell Putin again what I had been saying for months, that the ruble's devaluation was inevitable. So, to sum up, I did. Putin remained completely silent. Neither support nor opposition. No sound at all. It was hard to tell if he paid attention or not. I got up and left after my little speech. I had established the Institute for Economic Analysis 4 years prior, and I was serving as its director. After the Soviet Union fell, the Russian economy was in a state of flux, but we honed down on reforms and policies that would help it expand sustainably and eventually recover from the Great Depression that had gripped the country for 9 years. There was a severe scarcity of market-savvy economists during that turbulent era. I was recruited into the newly created Russian administration together with a handful of other young economists who had studied monetary policy and market economics professionally. Prior to Yegor Gaidar's resignation, I served as deputy director of the government's analytical center. Following his departure, Viktor Chernomyrdin offered me to be his main economic advisor. During my time in Moscow, I learned some encouraging things about a KGB lieutenant colonel who had been on the staff of the former mayor of St. Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak. There were a lot of economists in my inner group, as well as several anti-communists and Soviet dissidents against the KGB. Their complimentary remarks toward a former KGB officer were highly unusual. Despite my disbelief, my friends seemed unfazed. I was informed that he was a unique KGB member, a genuine reformer who defected to our side. I maintained my skepticism. A reformer who was a member of the KGB. That seemed like an incongruity to me. It couldn't possibly be true. They attempted to assuage my fears by assuring me that I was mistaken about him and that he appeared different when he was in the company of other KGB agents. That brief meeting in the Ministry of Finance building was the first time I ever met Putin. After Yeltsin left on New Year's Eve, 1999, I lost touch with him until Putin took over as president on February 28, 2000. As was my habit, the phone rang as I was seated at my institute conducting study. Putin wanted an economic advisor, so he invited me to meet with him that evening at his dacha outside of Moscow. Upon my arrival, I was picked up by a government vehicle. There were many people around, but Putin was noticeably absent. There was a lot of activity at the dacha during the height of the presidential campaign. After shaking hands with a few of people, Putin finally made an appearance and, at about 8 o'clock in the evening, urged me to sit down and have a chat. Even though the election was still a month away, Putin began to assemble his prospective cabinet members because nobody was denying his triumph. There was no assurance he would select me for the role of economic advisor because I had heard rumors that he had previously interviewed around 10 people, none of whom he had liked. Right from the start of our meeting, he wanted to know what my recommendation was for the Russian economy, asking, "And what do you want?" was my response. He seemed taken aback. As far as anyone could tell, no one had ever asked him that before. For a long time, Putin remained mute. He worked hard to figure out what he wanted to happen. Apparently, bringing in an economic advisor wasn't his idea. Maybe it was simply hinted at that he should have one. But why was this gadget necessary for him? His meaning was hazy. I suggested that he think about his priorities and the things he hopes to do in his 4 years in office before making a decision. Would he wish Russia to remain weak after another 9 years of economic crisis? Alternatively, to turn things around, revive the economy, and offer the Russian people a shot at success, he had no desire to govern a Russia that was weak. The issues plaguing the Russian economy and potential solutions were gradually covered in greater depth. The second war between Russia and Chechnya was underway at the time. We had been talking for about an hour when Putin's bodyguard discreetly handed him a message. After the assistant vanished, Putin read it and exclaimed with joy that Russian forces had captured Shadowy in the Caucasus Mountains, the final significant Chechen stronghold. The death of Chechens and Russians in his war was a terrible crime, and I took this opportunity to tell him so. Such an insult caught him off guard. For the next 15 to 20 minutes, we had an increasingly heated debate regarding the war. With each iteration of the debate, we ratcheted up the tension, stating our positions more firmly and raising the volume of our voices until we were almost at the point where we could no longer bear to communicate with the other person. We're both aware that if we made one more point in this dispute, our conversation and any potential connection would come to a halt. Putin yelled out, "Turn it off. The war will no longer be discussed." We sat quietly for a moment to collect ourselves. "Next," he stated, "let's talk about economics." Neither of us had it easy. Over the course of the next hour and a half, though, our focus shifted back to the Russian economy. Putin inquired whether I would be interested in joining his team as an economic advisor about 11 o'clock after we had spoken for 3 hours, and he mentioned that it was late. "Excuse me, but I declined." "Why?" he inquired, and I informed him. "I know what it's like to be a bureaucrat from my previous experience in government, and it's not fun." Putin was hoping that we could meet informally. "No problem," I said. "How about we meet the following day?" He inquired. My wife's arrival in Russia was on February 29, 1992, and I had plans to celebrate the anniversary that night, so I said sorry but no. For 4 years, on the leap year, we had a party. I went on to say that there was another rationale. Could he, as a Russian president with a renowned KGB past, fathom the impact on Russian society if his advisor's wife was American? "My wife is an American citizen." He froze, staring straight at me. Everybody shook hands, departed, certain that this would be our final encounter. The following day, my spouse and I visited the Seventh Heaven, a rotating restaurant situated 330 meters above ground in the Ostankino TV tower. This was one of the final vestiges of Soviet civilization that Westerners found appealing in a Russia that was rapidly changing. "Did you promise to meet your wife tonight?" said the voice on the other end of the phone on March 1, the afternoon I returned to my institute. Nothing showed up when I looked at my calendar, returned to Putin's dacha, and we resumed our discussion on economic matters. We maintained our daily or bi-weekly meeting schedule for over 2 months. I was soon extended invitations to his meetings at the White House and the Kremlin, as well as to his cross-country travels. Eventually agreed to be his economic advisor, but only after I set 3 requirements. First, if I felt the need, I could always give Putin a call. 2, I could visit any location I wanted and talk to anyone I wanted. Thirdly, there would be no limits on my ability to speak and comment publicly at any time I saw fit. I warned Putin that I would resign as his advisor the moment he disregarded those conditions. Was appointed Chief Economic Counsel to Putin the following day, April 12, 2000. This was the first appointment I had in Putin's new administration. The selection sent shockwaves around Russia because of my well-known market economic orientation and politically liberal beliefs. Putin was informed that I would remain until the year's end, and after that, everything would be decided. Despite my dissatisfaction with the results, I remained his advisor for nearly 6 years. During the G7, I also assumed the role of Russian Sherpa. In June 2002, Canadian Prime Minister Jean Chrétien declared Russia's full membership in the G8 in Kananaskis, and I was in charge of the Russian team that achieved this. Russia achieved a major victory. Statistically, Putin also deserves credit for the G8's success. Critics who say he doesn't belong in the modern world because he's stuck in the 1800s are completely mistaken. There is no way around the reality. Putin, on sometimes, would rather appear to be uninvolved. He doesn't necessarily believe what he says when he says something blatantly incorrect or offensive. He is merely engaging in a unique disinformation campaign or propaganda. He was aware of the truth in the majority of cases, both in private conversations with Putin and in public remarks about various policies and actions of his government. I was critical during my time working in the Kremlin of Putin himself, as well as the economy. I strongly opposed his 2003 nationalization of the Yukos oil business and the imprisonment of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, 2004.